Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. Like years ago, I mean, we haven't been around that many years, but a couple of years ago, I did a video called Composer Duels, where we took famous composers who are often thought of together and paired them up. And I asked you to choose which one you thought was superior, who was your favorite. And it was a lot of fun. It was like, Bach and Handel and Bruckner and Mahler and Sibelius and Nielsen, things like that, right? Well, now we're going to make the job a little trickier and maybe a little more fun, at least for some of you, because we're doing mediocre composer duels. Composers of the distinctly second rank, and you get to choose your poison. We have 16 of them. Holy mackerel. Yeah, because there are a lot more mediocre composers than there are great ones. So, it's easier to come up with. But in roughly chronological order, here we go. And you can choose as many or as few as you like. It's up to you. You could also propose some of your own if you'd like. And we will duel away. We're going to knock them out and slug away at these groups of mediocre composers. Let's start back in the Baroque. Albinoni versus Pachelbel, the one-shot wonders of the Baroque period. Albinoni known, of course, for his Adagio, Pachelbel for his inevitable canon. Oh, my goodness, which one of those do you go for? Do you not care at all? I can understand both positions. I really can. So take your pick. Next, the classical period. Koželuch versus Dittersdorf. Who, you might ask? Well, Dittersdorf was rather well known, actually. He's famous for his little symphonies based on Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Koželuch, he wrote symphonies. He was there. He was one of those. No, he was one of this great Czech tradition of classical period composers. And they all wrote entertaining music. I'm not saying, by the way, that a mediocre composer is bad, necessarily. Just that they're not famous, not recognized as the top tier. Mediocre composers can write the occasional masterpiece amongst the piles of worthless rubbish that they churned out otherwise. So, yeah, Koželuch versus Dittersdorf. Go for it. Next, a little bit later, Hummel versus Ries. Well, Hummel, this is an interesting pairing because Hummel was essentially a Mozart follower and a forerunner almost of like Chopin, really fascinating. And Ries was, of course, an FOB, a friend of Beethoven. And they wrote tons of music, concertos and symphonies and all kinds of things, some of which are delightful. And you get to pick which one you think is better, assuming you know both of them. We can only do this because the wonderful classical music recording industry has just churned out reams of this stuff. All of this music now has been recorded. It's available to sample, so you can listen and judge. And part of the trick behind the composer duel concept is to encourage you to listen and judge, even if the composers are mediocre. Of course, that's simply my label. You may think that they're not mediocre. You might think that they're stunning and undeservedly neglected and misunderstood geniuses who only you have the perspicacity to comprehend. So yeah, lots of possibilities here. Next, Thalberg versus Moscheles. Oh my goodness, yeah. These are the virtuoso pianist guys. They wrote reams and reams of operatic potpourris and music based on other people's tunes for the delectation of admirers of virtuosi of their instruments. This is the rise of the giant, virtuoso type thing. And by the way, those of you who've seen my Classical Music's Dirtiest Secrets and have signed on to the List is Trash secret, you haven't heard anything yet, unless you've heard Thalberg and Moscheles, or Moscheles, I used to call it Moscheles, but I found out from a bunch of musicologist friends of mine that it was Moscheles. So I have no idea. But you can compare and contrast. Oh, and this one was one that you proposed. In fact, it was the inspiration for this entire concept. Spohr versus Raff. Ugh. The two greatest symphonists, or most popular symphonists, the most popular German symphonists after Beethoven in the entire, 19th century. Can you believe it? They were not exactly contemporaries. Raff came later, but yeah, because they both wrote bunches of symphonies, and that's what gets compared. And I think that the comparison is salutary and interesting. I mean, you'll notice I'm not taking a position. I'm not taking a position on any of these. I want you to take the position. I do have an opinion about them, but that's secret. Well, it'll come out in various videos over the decades. So after Spohr versus Raff, we go to Russia. Rubinstein versus Cui. Yeah, Cui. We've got Anton Rubinstein, who wrote just gobs and gobs and gobs of music, and César Cui, who was one of the Kuchka, the mighty handful, the big five. It's Rimsky and Borodin and Balakirev and Cui and Mussorgsky and it's the one I always leave out. Anyway, so they're the Lyudov, or I don't know, who knows. Anyway, yeah, so Cui. I mean, Cui's one of those guys who was telling everyone else what to do, but no one knows anything that he wrote himself. So this is to encourage you to go run out there and find some Cui and decide if he rises to the level of Rubinstein or vice versa. Is it better to be prolific, or is it better to be very selectively, not prolific? Then we have, the violinists, because we did the pianists. So we have to do the violinists. Wieniawski versus Vieuxtemps. These were violinist composers who wrote most of their own music. They wrote music for themselves to play, which was a good thing because nobody else wants to play it. Well, nowadays, of course, other people do play it. And you have to think about whether or not any of that stuff is worth reviving. It's very virtuosic. It's very exciting. It's marvelously written for the instrument. And, well, definitely mediocre, at least in my humble opinion. Oh, and then we've got a couple German opera guys. Siegfried Wagner versus Eugene Thalberg. Now, Thalberg was a student of Liszt, and he was actually known for other things as well. I mean, he was a virtuoso pianist, but after he got married, after he, graduated from, Liszt Academy, he wound up writing a bunch of operas, of which the most famous was Tiefland. Siegfried Wagner, of course, has been revived in recent years by CPO, and his operas and his orchestral works have been recorded very, very nicely. And so you get to hear both of them, and you can decide if any of them are worth your time. Who wrote sort of post-Wagnerian opera stuff. Thalberg, by the way, was famous for having married the Venezuelan piano virtuosa Teresa Carreño. And the famous line was they were both married millions of times, and they had all these kids, both with each other and with other people. And Carreño famously once said to Eugene Thalberg, "Darling, my children and your children are quarreling with our children again." I just think that's one of those famous lines in classical music lore. But anyway, Siegfried Wagner, okay, yeah, are they both has-beens? Well, you tell me. And then we're going to stick with operas. I love this one. Giordano versus Zandonai. Giordano, the famous composer of Andrea Chenier, and Zandonai, the famous composer of Francesca da Rimini. One-shot wonders in the operatic world. I didn't even go for Leoncavallo and Mascagni. That one was too easy. No, and some of their other stuff has popped up lately, and you can decide if it's every bit as mediocre as their more famous pieces. And then back to Russia. Glière versus Kabalevsky. Two composers who had no problems whatsoever working with the Soviet regime. Glière in a very conservative romantic style throughout his career. Kabalevsky in a slightly less conservative, sort of Prokofiev-y, wrong note romanticist style. Both are famous, essentially, for like one little short piece. Glière, the Russian sailor's dance from his ballet The Red Poppy, and Kabalevsky, the comedian's gallop from his suite The Comedians. They're both little tiny dance things, and they wrote big, big works. Of course, Glière's Third Symphony, and Kabalevsky's famous for his piano concertos and a couple symphonies. So yeah, there are larger works too. Are they all equally forgettable? And America is not exempt from this sort of contest, especially in the 19th century. Oh goodness. Let's take MacDowell versus John Knowles Paine. Now, Edward MacDowell was another student of Liszt. He was America's greatest 19th century composer. Just look at the names on all the concert halls, on the proscenium surrounding us. You get Gluck, and you get Handel, and Bach, and Mozart, and Beethoven, and MacDowell. Paine never made it onto a proscenium, but he wrote a couple of symphonies in a conservative Brahmsian idiom and a couple tone poems, like a few other things that have gotten some attention recently in the series of American composers, desperate for recognition. And you can see if either of them is worth your time and trouble. And after that, we have the French people. Oh, the French people. Lalo versus Dandy, both of whom are popular for single concertante works. Lalo, the Symphony Espagnole, and Dandy, the Symphony on a French Mountain Air. I have opinions about all of these pieces that you probably know, but they also wrote a lot of orchestral music and ballets and symphonic poems and tons of stuff, and they are certainly relegated to the second rate by history and by repertoire selection and performance in concert. And is that justified? You tell me. And then England. Oh, we get to do England. Oh yes, the old Celtic Twilight people. There were a whole bunch of those, just a gazillion Celtic Twilight composers. Two of the most famous, Bantock, Granville Bantock, and Rutland Boughton. I mean, they're also deserve to be compared in terms of mediocrity because of their first names. Granville versus Rutland. Sure. I mean, it's just, they were doomed from birth. Let's put it that way. And you can decide whether Rutland Boughton, the composer of The Immortal Hour, was like the most popular opera ever written in the first half of the 20th century by an English person, or Bantock, who wrote the Hebridean Symphony and The Witch of Someplace and the Witch of Atlas, or I don't know, A Witch of Somewhere, and all kinds of stuff. Give it a shot. Tell me what you think. Oh, and back to Germany. Oh yeah, now we're getting sort of into the 20th century. Pfitzner versus Max von Schillings. Oh God, I mean, post-Wagnerian wannabes, both of them. I mean, let's see, Schillings they both wrote operas, individual operas that were somewhat famous in their day. Pfitzner was Palestrina, and Schillings was, I think, Mona Vanna, or something like that. And or Mona somebody, I don't know, her name was Mona. And he also wrote orchestral works, and Pfitzner wrote orchestral works, and that stuff's been recorded now, so we can listen and judge for ourselves just how uninteresting they really are, and which of the two was the lesser interesting of the two. And now we're going into the modern period. Oh, this is so much fun. One of the problems with the avant-garde, with modern composers, is that you're not supposed to criticize them because they have styles which are entirely personal and original. And because they're personal and original, they manage to immunize themselves from actual criticism, because who do you compare it to? It's like, if it's your own language, it's like comparing, I don't know, Mandarin to Cantonese. I mean, they're different languages. How can one be better than any other? They just are. They just exist. Well, I think that's all bullshit. We are perfectly capable of making musical judgments amongst contemporary composers who get played, sort of, kind of, but nobody much cares about them or wants to hear them anymore. Luigi Nono versus Hans Werner Henze. Yeah, that's a really good one, because both of them were left-wing political activist composers who wrote stage works embodying their desire to uplift the proletariat in a musical language that no sane proletarian would ever spend 30 seconds listening to. And they all existed sucking up public subsidies and subventions by the government to write their left-wing proletarian music that no proletarian would spend 30 seconds listening to, or non-proletarians. They're not too fond of it either. So which of these two was the bigger phony? I ask you, take your pick. And finally, I think it's fun to go back to England and the former avant-garde, later faux, sort of romantic, quasi-approachable, not very interesting at anything composers. Well, that's not entirely true. Peter Maxwell Davies, his 8 songs for a Mad King and Miss Donithorne's Maggot and his early avant-garde pieces, they were fun. Then he just sort of lapsed into this endless note dribbling of total grayness with his dreary symphonies and the Strathclyde concertos and the Naxos quartets, and they're ambitious and they're quasi-traditional in the sense that they employ traditional forms, and they're supposedly based on thematic ideas, which maybe you'll remember one. They did write an Orkney Wedding with Sunrise. That was cute. So Maxwell Davies, who really just didn't evolve into anything, and Nicholas Maw, a composer who enjoyed 15 minutes of fame for his enormous orchestral work, Odyssey, which I actually saw performed live. Leonard Slatkin brought it to Carnegie Hall. This enormous symphonic effusion that would have been marvelous if it had a tune. I mean, that's all it was lacking. It had everything else. It had big climaxes. It had lush orchestration, but most of it was a sort of quasi, not quite tonal, not quite tuneful, wannabe kind of piece. It was always in the process of trying to be something that it never really was. And his violin concerto, which is even worse. Oh my God, it was recorded on Sony. I wrote, I think, a rather entertaining review of that at ClassicsToday.com. And Maw had his, like Maxwell Davies, even more so, a burst of fame towards the end of his life. And now you don't hear a word about him. And you don't really hear a word about Maxwell Davies either. Is that a good thing? I mean, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it doesn't matter, because you get to choose which one of them you would prefer. Although you may not prefer either, but it doesn't matter, because in this particular exercise, you have to pick. So based on your own experience of listening to these guys, if you've had any, or if you want to acquire some, I urge you to spend a little time listening and enjoying the mediocrities of the musical world. There are gems in there. There truly are. And then there's a lot of wretched refuse. And might call it the wretched refuse of Europe's teeming shores, as the poem goes. And we are going to go garbage picking. It's really a lot of fun to do. I have to tell you, it really is. It's part of the joys of music, is listening and judging and being a little critical. Doesn't hurt. So keep on listening, friends. I'm looking forward to your list. Take care.